and in the decisive context that was happening as a result of the actions of the US and their other Western colleagues, of NATO extension and unipolar world taking hold. As for our geopolitical space, it was done in the interests of restraining Russia, containing Russia, and to that end, for many years, Ukraine was used consistently as a springboard, as a foothold in order to irritate and contain our country. Ukrainian government activity was encouraged in their activity, that all those actions that prohibited everything Russian information, Russian culture, Russian language, and in parallel with that, it was enshrined in legislative framework all those steps that promote the Nazi theory and the Nazi practices. Quite naturally, the UN Secretary-General knows full well of those decisions that were declared by President Putin about the reasons and the targets, the goals of the operation that is conducted by our military with the Donetsk and Luhansk militia on the territory of the Ukraine. These goals are, first and foremost, to protect the civilian population, and here we have an interest of working together with our UN colleagues, together with colleagues from the International Red Cross Committee, as for additional efforts to alleviate the suffering and the situation for the civilian population. The UN, after the contacts between the UN Secretary-General with our Ministry of Defense, which happened almost 2 months ago, we have agreed and we have created a working group that is based here in Moscow at our Ministry of Defense. UN representatives agree on specific things, negotiate specific things that allow to safely deliver humanitarian aid through the UN, through Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, managed to launch 5 such humanitarian convoys. They were dispatched to different regions of the Ukraine, in addition to the humanitarian aid that is daily being given out to Ukrainian citizens and Donetsk and Luhansk as well, naturally, through Russian military, Russian Ministry of Defense, and Emergency Ministry, and other NGOs of Russia. Today we have discussed possible actions, how to strengthen our cooperation on this track, and I think that as the outcome of negotiations in Moscow, we'll be able to define what kind of steps we can take, whether they will be relevant in the current situation. Naturally, we talked about the future of the UN in general, about those attempts of our Western colleagues, first and foremost, to place the discussion of crucial matters outside of universal formats, outside of the UN and its system, creating rubber stamping different partnerships and institutions, and issuing calls who have been presented as the forefront of humanity, as the select few. And the same way goes for the alliance of multilateralism promoted by Germany and France. Is it not in competition with the UN? As well as the US initiative, who last year held a summit for democracy. They issued invitations on their own without consulting anyone. And we have called the attention of our partners today during the negotiations. This is an alarm bell for the UN. This is an attempt to cross out the basic rules of the UN Charter, the basic principles of the UN Charter, and that is that the organization was created on the basis of sovereign equality of states. This is enshrined in the UN Charter, and we have to remind about that. We'll do that more often, so that no one, neither in New York nor in other member countries, would forget about that. And in the end, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to the UN Secretary-General, who has initiated such contact. We have readily responded, and that highlights the great significance that we attach to regular dialogue and comparing notes with the leadership of the UN Secretariat. I think that through all difficulties that continue to multiply in global affairs, such a frank and honest discussion is very, very useful, so that in the end we could go back to the sources, to the UN Charter, and on the basis of this charter we could build any kind of mechanism how to develop multilateralism. Multilateralism today is one of the key terms. Once again, I'd like to thank Secretary-General for giving this framework for today's conversation. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, as Secretary-General of the United Nations, I came to Moscow as a messenger of peace. My objective and my agenda is strictly linked to save lives and to reduce suffering. I had a very frank discussion with the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, and it is clear that there are two different positions on what is happening in Ukraine. According to the Russian Federation, what is taking place is a special military operation with the objectives that were announced. According to the UN, in line with the resolutions passed by the General Assembly, Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a violation of its territorial integrity and against the Charter of the United Nations. But it is my deep conviction that the sooner we end this war, the better, for the people of Ukraine, for the people of the Russian Federation, and those far beyond. The United Nations has repeatedly called for ceasefires to protect civilians and to facilitate a political dialogue to reach a solution. So far, that has not been possible. Today, across the Donbass, a violent battle is underway with tremendous deaths and destruction. Many civilians are being killed, and hundreds of thousands of people are in life-threatening conditions trapped by the conflict. I'm concerned about the repeated reports of violations of international humanitarian and human rights law and possible war crimes, and they require independent investigation for effective accountability. And we urgently need humanitarian corridors that are truly safe and effective and that are respected by all to evacuate civilians and deliver much-needed assistance. To that end, I have proposed the establishment of a humanitarian contact group bringing together the Russian Federation, Ukraine and the United Nations to look for opportunities for the opening of safe corridors with local cessation of hostilities and to guarantee that they are actually effective. Simultaneously, we recognize that we face a crisis within a crisis in Mariupol. Thousands of civilians are in dire need of life-saving humanitarian assistance and many of evacuation. The United Nations is ready to fully mobilize its human and logistical resources to help save lives in Mariupol. My proposal is for a coordinated work of the United Nations, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Ukraine and Russian Federation forces to enable the safe evacuation of those civilians who want to leave, both inside the Azovstal plan and in the city, in any direction they choose, and to deliver the humanitarian aid required. And this is not just about what is happening in Ukraine, as we are seeing shockwaves around the world. The dramatic acceleration of the increase of the prices for food and energy that was already taking place in the last year are causing enormous suffering to hundreds of millions of the most vulnerable people worldwide. And this comes on top of the shock of the continued COVID-19 pandemic and the uneven access to resources for recovery that particularly penalize developing countries around the world. And so the sooner peace is established, the better for the sake of Ukraine, Russia, and for the world. And it's very important, even in these moments of difficulty, to keep alive the values of multilateralism. We need a world that is multipolar, with multilateral institutions, and those multilateral institutions must abide by the UN Charter and by international law. And abiding by the UN Charter and by international law, recognizing full equality among states, they hopefully will be an instrument that will allow us once again to come together as humankind and address the dramatic challenges we face, from climate change to epidemics and to many others, and in which the only war we should have would be a war of those that put the planet at risk.
Уважаемые коллеги, переходим к вопросам. Пожалуйста, India Today.
Moving on to questions, please, India Today.
I am Geeta Mohan from India Today. I have a question each from both the leadership, beginning with the United Nations Secretary-General, sir. Mr. Guterres, sir, there are allegations and counter-allegations regarding genocide, war crimes, human shields, as also reports of chemical weapons and biological weapons being used. You spoke about contact group and humanitarian corridors. You also spoke about investigations. Will the United Nations look at independent investigations, creating a team, an investigating team, to look into the facts on the ground? And my question to the Foreign Minister, sir, both sides, whether it's the United Nations or the international community, are looking at negotiated settlement and ceasefire. Should Russia look at a negotiated settlement? Is there a country or an organization that could act as a mediator? Who would Russia consider as a mediating agency? Thank you.
Well, the UN Secretariat has not the power to do investigations of that kind. We have the International Criminal Court, we have the different mechanisms that exist in the human rights system, namely commissions of inquiry. It is not my intention to promote an investigation myself. I have not the authority for it, but I think it's very important to have independent investigations in order to have full credibility and full accountability.
Now, as for the question addressed to me, first I wanted to say about the positions that the international community is taking and what the UN should think about these positions. Naturally, simultaneously with the inviolable principles of the UN, for example, sovereign equality of states, as I said. Mr. Secretary-General referenced a General Assembly resolution that condemned Russia and the situation, what's happening in the Ukraine. It was deemed intrusion, invasion, and a violation of territorial integrity. This was a resolution that was voted on. It was not a consensus resolution. Many countries complained that they were forced to vote like that, and the US were capturing ambassadors and pushing them to do that, threatening to use their children going to universities or accounts in the American banks. I'm not exaggerating here. Still, this resolution was not voted unanimously on. Several dozen countries refused to support it. Naturally, every General Assembly resolution is a mandate for the Secretariat, and the Secretariat is explaining its approach here. However, the Security Council resolutions should also be sacred for the Secretariat, especially consensus resolution, when all 15 members vote for a specific solution. And it was through consensus that in February 2015 that the document was endorsed. It was called the Minsk Package of Measures. This paper clearly states there is a need for a direct dialogue between Kiev, Donetsk, and Luhansk in order to settle all issues back then within the territorial integrity of the Ukraine. The only thing that was necessary is to fulfill the obligations that first President Poroshenko signed under, then President Zelensky, and to give a special status to self-declared Donetsk and Luhansk republics, to ensure amnesty, to ensure, in agreement with the republics, the constitution of the Ukraine, considering the decentralization, but maintaining the territorial integrity of the Ukraine, and later also in agreement with Donetsk and Luhansk to arrange elections. I do not remember that the UN Secretary referenced somehow this direct and blatant sabotage by Kiev of this Minsk agreement. And it was a consensus UN Security Council resolution, which is part of international law, the UN Security Council resolutions. We spoke about that today, and quite frankly, we've known each other for a long time. We have good, friendly relations, and I think such a conversation is impossible to be postponed forever. At this point in time, we're at the stage of international relations when the moment of truth comes. Either we all agree that one entity with its satellites decides how the humanity will live in the future, or the humanity will be living by the UN Charter. It's a very simple choice. No one wants to have any war, God forbid. However, presenting the arguments and demanding response from those who violate the UN Charter, that's a must. And I'm telling you that more and more countries with their history, civilization, and culture, with great legacy, want to hold this position, because this conversation cannot be avoided. And I hope that the UN, this institution rooted in the UN Charter, the greatest document of all times, will be a catalyst in the development of this frank and honest dialogue without ultimatums, without threats, and without attempts to solve issues by force, including by the force of financial and economic power, what else our Western colleagues have, and that they abuse their position in the global system. And I think this is a very blatant abuse. As for negotiation solutions, naturally, we would like to have a negotiation solution. If you remember, at the beginning of March, right when President Zelensky offered to have negotiations, we have agreed, but the way the Ukrainian delegation behaved at the negotiations, and later the President Zelensky himself refusing to acknowledge what they confirmed a week before, and they received new proposals. Well, this is very disheartening. It seems that they're not very interested in negotiations, and they think that, as they were promised by those who call not to let Russia win, and those to call to defeat and destroy Russia, that those will continue to pump Ukraine full of weapons, in tremendous amounts of weapons. If that will continue, naturally, negotiations are hardly going to result in anything, but still, I repeat once again, we're committed to a negotiation solution and to a ceasefire. That is what we're doing every day, declaring humanitarian corridors daily. And they've been ignored by Azovstal-based Azov Nazis using Nazi insignia of Nazi Waffen-SS battalions, that President Zelensky, responding to the CNN question, said that we have many such battalions, they are the way they are. And this phrase, they are the way they are, was cut out of the interview. It seemed a bit too much, too shameful to present that to the Western democratic community, a person with all of his subliminal thoughts. So we're prepared to to hold negotiations. If anyone has very interesting ideas, we're prepared to listen to them. As for mediation, per se, at this stage, well, at the previous stage, the Ukrainian negotiators did not mention that. Our teams are meeting one-on-one. They've met 3 times in Belarus. They've met once in Turkey. These are platforms for negotiations, and we'd like to thank both hosts for organizing and for the warm welcome. However, talking about the mediators at this stage, I think it's a bit premature. We'd like to receive the response for our last draft of the document that we have transferred about 10 or 12 days ago, that the Ukrainian negotiators did not report to their president. At least a week ago, he was not aware of this document. Thank you.
Was mentioned, I'd like to say that the Secretariat entirely respects and abides by all resolutions of the General Assembly and of the Security Council. And today, if I regret something, is that the UN was not allowed to be part of the Normandy format to follow the Minsk agreement and to be able to form a very clear-cut opinion about the failure of the Minsk agreement. On the other hand, I would like to say that I understand that the Russian Federation has many grievances. But the UN Charter foresees a large number of mechanisms in which grievances can be addressed, and namely with the recourse to the International Court of Justice or other mechanisms if all the other ones foreseen in the Charter fail. But there is one thing that is true and obvious, and that no arguments can change. We have not Ukrainian troops in the territory of the Russian Federation, but we have Russian troops in the territory of the Ukrainian Federation.
Это правда.
That is true. I confirm that.
Lenta.eu news outlet. Valentina Schwartz, Lenta.eu. I have questions for both of the speakers. Mr. Minister, as expected, later today the UN General Assembly will vote on the draft resolution of Liechtenstein on the veto right, providing for convening of the General Assembly each time a P5 country imposes a veto. How do you think, what is the Moscow take on this initiative, and what is the Moscow's attitude towards reforming the Security Council and the possibility of repealing the imposed veto after the GA Assembly is held in the aftermath? And to Mr. Guterres, being the Secretary-General of the UN, do you think that the veto mechanism should be reformed? With respect to the draft resolution submitted to the GA, it has no relation whatsoever, and it will not impact in any way the ongoing, for a number of years, talks on reforming the UN Security Council. I can state responsibly that the veto right will be there. It is one of the foundations of international organization and affairs. Otherwise, the entity, the United Nations, will find itself in disarray, because the great powers and the great nations rely upon the principle of unanimous decision that is enshrined in the Charter. But at the same time, the world has changed, and the Americans want, as they claim, make it unipolar for good. But you know, the developments and the progress of developments has been counter to that. It is becoming a multipolar world, and we want to avoid the over-dominance of one group of countries. 6 out of 15 seats belong to the West, and the developing nations are underrepresented, want to see more Africa, Asia, and Latin America as part of that body permanently. And we made direct mention of our partners from India and Brazil, but definitely we also want candidatures from Africa. So the resolution the draft resolution rather, that you have mentioned, and that is about applying a convention of General Assembly session to discuss the veto, has no bearing on that. It is about a more democratic way to make decisions. We would be ready to join the consensus, if any. It is important to work on the consensus basis, because many resolutions that are adopted and approved by a minority of votes will become prevalent because of the efforts of the Western countries. But I would go even farther. The Security Council may be stripped of the powers to adopt a resolution as a result of applying one or several vetoes, but also as a result of abstentions by 6 or 7 countries, which would mean also that there is a cleft in the Security Council, and the General Assembly should not be indifferent to that. I believe that it is a sound practice. If a country applies its veto right, it means that it has some rationale behind it, and in the event that it is about the decisions by the Russian Federation, we will be able to provide our cogent arguments that we present in the Security Council.
Interpret those that so many years ago created the Charter. I believe the reason of the veto was to avoid a situation in which a confrontation among the members of the group of permanent members might lead to another global war. And so the veto was a kind of an element introduced to avoid this kind of danger. It is also true that as time went by, the veto has probably been used too many times, as in many circumstances it's used without vital interests of a country existing. And so I'm very much in favor of a moderate use of the veto, having no illusions about the possibility of changing it. I don't think that it will be possible to have a majority, a two-thirds majority in the General Assembly, with the 5 members agreeing on changing that. But I also believe it's important to enlarge the Security Council and to have a more equitative representation, particularly the country like Africa. Africa is a double victim of colonialism. First of all, because it suffered colonialism itself, and second, because many of the countries only gained independence when the international institutions had already been created. And so Africa is underrepresented in decision-making processes in most of the multilateral institutions. And so I do believe that a stronger representation of developing countries in many areas, from the Bretton Woods institutions to the Security Council, would be an important reform.
Пожалуйста, телевидение Китая.
The Chinese television.
Первый вопрос.
My questions to Minister Lavrov. How has Russia responded to the Ukrainian proposal to hold a special round of talks in Mariupol? And the second question, what measures have been taken by the Russian side against the stepping up of the American arms supplies to Kiev? Well, yes, I have heard about this circus of a proposal by the Ukrainian negotiation team. There was the team that was in touch with our negotiators in Belarus, then in Istanbul, and then on teleconf, to hold another meeting just next to Azovstal smelter. Well, that would be a real feta, a token gesture. They probably wanted another heart-rending scene to be displayed on the media, but if speaking in earnest, and with the end of promoting the talks, I wish they would swiftly respond to our proposal submitted around 10 days ago, and Zelensky hasn't heard anything of that, as we find out. With respect to the arms supplies to Kyiv, it's not only the Americans that do that. They prefer to compel the Europeans to supply and ship weapons, although they make steps themselves. But we said repeatedly that as soon as it ends up in Ukraine, these arms and hardware become legitimate goals and targets for our military on the ground, vindicating and upholding the rights of the people that were victims of the shelling for 8 years, and irrespective of the composition of the Normandy format, including France and Germany, they were silent on that. And all these years we saw outrageous suppression towards the Russian-speaking population, not only in the two proclaimed republics, but also those residing in Ukraine. You can look at the track record of the lawmakers and all the legislation passed against the Russian speakers and the Russian language channels or Ukrainian channels owned by some parliamentary opposition parties or any banned parties. And later it was decided to prohibit the use of the Russian language in day-to-day life, and the Nazi ideologies and practices were imposed, and everybody kept a blind eye onto that, and both inside and outside the Normandy format. And those arms that at that point were shipped to Ukraine were a threat to the Russian Federation, and the military bases like the one by Britain ashore of the Azov Sea were a direct threat to us. And unfortunately we heard no voices of backing from any area of the world when we, as a last resort, came up with the proposal to conclude treaties to provide for the security in Europe without expanding the military alliances. Now, currently, we are eliminating the threats and the activities by the West in breach of their obligations not to strengthen their security at the expense of Russia's security. And the final question will be from the Sputnik news outlet. Very good afternoon, Mr. Minister. Very good afternoon, Secretary-General. I have questions to both of the speakers. Mr. Minister, not long ago, Russia has accredited the first diplomat from the government of Taliban. Does that mean that we are moving towards recognizing the Talib's government in Kabul? And the second question is whether Russia is ready to work with inter-Afghan political movements and forces, encouraging them and engaging them in the new inclusive Afghan government, as has been recently proposed by President of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi. And questions to Secretary-General: how can you comment on the unlawful expropriation of the Russian diplomatic property in the United States, as well as abuses by Washington of the host country status, when a number of diplomats, including Russian diplomats, are denied visas to partake in UN meetings? What steps and actions the UN Secretariat has been taken in order to bring the United States to account so that it complies with its international obligations? And the question number two is on Afghanistan. You called on the US to unblock the Afghan assets and freeze the assets to avoid a humanitarian collapse there. Any steps, any developments on that part? Well, we indeed accredited a diplomat who was sent to work in the embassy by the new authorities, the Taliban movement, which does not mean an official diplomatic recognition. We are in lockstep here with the key neighbors of Afghanistan, and recently a high-profile conference was held in China, and we participated together with Iran and Pakistan, and we just look at the real situation. We're guided by that, and we have regular contacts with the Talibs, by the embassy and by other departments and agencies looking into economic cooperation. And during the Soviet stay in Afghanistan, more than 140 factories and enterprises were built. They became the backbone of the Afghan economy, and in brackets, I'd say that over the 20 years of NATO's stay in Afghanistan, not a single facility was built, and it boiled down to you know what. So we want to move towards a full-fledged diplomatic recognition by the new authorities, given that they deliver on their commitment and establish an inclusive government, not only from the sectarian viewpoint. They have the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, and Hari nationality, but anyway, the true inclusivity will be something we'll look at. We work with the political forces in Afghanistan and Kabul, the ex-President Karzai, the ex-Chief Executive Abdullah, and they are interested in dialogue with the Talibs, and we encourage them to launch and pursue this dialogue.
By Afghanistan. We have decided since the very beginning to engage actively with the Taliban, and we have a massive humanitarian operation in Afghanistan. But we recognize that humanitarian aid is not enough. In the absence of cash, in the absence of liquidity in the economy in Afghanistan, the collapse of the economy can have devastating consequences for the people of Afghanistan. So we have been claiming that the international community needs to create conditions for cash to be injected in the Afghan economy. We have done it ourselves. The UN is bringing by plane banknotes to Afghanistan. We already did about $500 million US. We have been pushing the World Bank in order for the World Bank to disburse amounts that are foreseen in relation to Afghanistan. And we are working together with the Central Bank and the American Treasury to remove the obstacles that still exist in relation to the need to unfreeze the money that is available. And we hope that this will be true for all the countries that have these assets frozen. We believe naturally that we need to do everything for the good of the people in Afghanistan, but we are also engaging with the Taliban very seriously in relation to the inclusivity of the government and inclusivity between men and women, but also inclusivity in order for Uzbeks, Tajiks, Hazaras, as it was said, to be fully included in the political process in Afghanistan, on the need for Afghanistan not to be a base for any kind of terrorist activities outside its territory, and of course also to be able to defeat terrorism inside the territory, and on the need to respect a number of fundamental rights. And here there are two questions of great concern to me. One is the possibility of girls to be in school, especially in secondary school and in the university. There was a negative decision recently. I hope it will be overcome quickly. And the second, the right of women to work and to exercise their professions in the country, as it is happening to the UN staff, female UN staff, that is indeed allowed to work at the present moment. On the other hand, we believe that it is very important that all member states, including the Russian Federation, have a normal treatment of their visa requirements. It is essential to have the full participation of all countries into UN procedures, and we will be keeping a very strong position with the host country in order to guarantee that we move swiftly in that direction.
Спасибо. А вот сейчас ответили вам на него. Это такая у нас есть, у дипломатов такая есть манера.
What has been, it has been responded, I mean, about the host country in a thinly veiled manner.
Thank you very much. Good